Hi, everyone. I want to welcome you to our first American Studies dialogue. With I'm this year's lead for our SST's American Studies program. My name is Dr. Suhey Vega, and I just wanted to thank you for attending this timely conversation on electoral politics, and hope you'll be thrilled with the depth of knowledge represented by our American Studies faculty and students at SST and at ASU. I also wanted to bring attention to our new American Studies MA degree program. We are currently accepting applications, and I want to mention that we hope to have our undergraduate BA approved for fall 2021 start date. If you'd like to be part of an email list or get updates on our events like this and any other ASU American Studies news, please email me at the address provided above or above in front of you in the slide here. If you are a graduate student and would like to learn more about American Studies, I am teaching American Studies 502 Theory and Method this spring. With that, I'll toss it over to one of our students, Kay Anderson, and one of our faculty, Dr. Claudia Sadowski-Smith, will handle Q&A, which will start at 3:45 AZ time. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. So to introduce the topic for today's dialogue, with the presidential election upcoming, one of the questions increasingly being asked among some voters who already feel alienated from the US democratic system is why vote? Our committee decided to host a dialogue among 3 ASU faculty with various interdisciplinary backgrounds and experiences that engages this question seriously and critically. We're honored to have these 3 faculty with us today. Dr. Marlon M. Bailey is Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies, African and African American Studies, and American Studies in the School of Social Transformation here at ASU. Dr. Bailey's book, Butch Queens Up in Pumps, Gender Performance and Ballroom Culture in Detroit, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2013. In 2014, Butch Queens Up in Pumps was awarded the Alan Bray Memorial Book Prize by GLQ Caucus of Modern Language Association and a finalist for the Lambda Literary Book Award in LGBTQ Studies. He is a member of the Black Sexual Economies Collective, which co-edited the collection Black Sexual Economies, Race and Sex in the Culture of Capital. Dr. Bailey has published in American Quarterly, GLQ, Signs, Feminist Studies, Souls, Gender, Place, and Culture, the Journal of Gay and Lesbian Social Services, AIDS Patient Care and STDs, LGBTQ Health, and several book collections. Dr. Bailey currently serves on the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine's Committee on Understanding the Status and Well-Being of Sexual and Gender Diverse Populations. He also serves on the Black African American Expert Panel for the COVID-19 Vaccine Trial Network. Please welcome Dr. Bailey. Also on our panel for today, Dr. Rafael Martinez. He is an assistant professor of Southwest Borderlands for the College of Integrative Science and Arts here at ASU. Dr. Martinez earned his PhD in American Studies from the University of New Mexico. Dr. Martinez's work focuses on immigration, migration, the US-Mexico borderlands, and the American Southwest. Here at ASU, he teaches courses on the American Southwest, pop culture issues, and the US-Mexico borderlands. As a public scholar, Dr. Martinez engages in projects that seek to connect academic work with community development. As such, Rafael is a part of ASU's inaugural Interdisciplinary Solutions for Social Impact Lab program aimed at combining interdisciplinary faculty and graduate students from across campus to bring interdisciplinary solutions to pressing societal issues. Please welcome Dr. Martinez. And finally, on our panel, we have Dr. H.L.T. Kwan. Dr. Kwan is a political theorist, an award-winning filmmaker, and associate professor of justice studies, Asian Pacific American Studies, and African and African American Studies in the School of Social Transformation. and is affiliated with the Center for Race and Democracy here at ASU. Her community work and research center movements for justice and race, gender, and radical thought. Dr. Kwan's most recent work is an edited collection of essays by Cedric J. Johnson on racial capitalism, Black internationalism, and cultures of resistance. Her monograph, Growth Against Democracy, Savage Developmentism in the Modern World, is a radical critique of modern development thinking and programs, including neoliberalism. Dr. Kwan is currently the editor in residence for the Social Justice Praxis Center blog, and Dr. Kwan's current book project, Against Tyranny, Ungovernability, and Tools for Democratic Living, explores willful resistance to various forms of governing. Please welcome all of our panelists. Thank you all for participating. Panelists, you can now open your video. So to start the first question, well, before we start questions, we'll have 35 to 40 minutes for intro and dialogue, and then we will open it up to our attendees for question and answers. For attendees, please post any questions you have for the panelists in our Q&A window in the bottom of the Zoom. So to start off our dialogue, the first question is, why is voting seen as the primary civic duty for US citizens?
I'll start. Thank you, Kay Anderson, for the excellent introduction, and thank you, the American Studies program, Dr. Vega, and others for putting this very important discussion together, organizing this very important panel. I'd like to start by saying that indeed, voting is seen and also represented as a primary civic duty. Unfortunately, voting is seen and represented as a only, or the end of, or the end point, the end goal of a civic duty, and it is not. While voting is extremely important, and I'm sure we will discuss further in more specificity why that is the case, but voting is a tool. It is a necessary tool that is a part of the process of an ongoing engagement with social and individual collective determination. The overemphasization placed on voting as a primary civic duty leads people to think that all they need to do is vote and then that's a wrap. And those who are invested in controlling, regulating, minoritizing, oppressing the vast majority of the population benefits from that notion that voting is the end all be all. And since a large portion of the population feels alienated from the democratic system, those who are invested in maintaining vast and deep social inequality benefit from folks believing that the answer is to divest from electoral engagement and also see voting as the end all be all. Voting is a tool, it is a process, it is a strategy among many. We are at war, and when you are at war, you use every tool that you have available to you within a given set of circumstances and given conditions. So I'll leave it at that.
I could go ahead and jump in here. And I would also like to thank the organizers for this great event and very much a timely discussion that we're having here today. So thank you, Kay, for that great introduction. Thank you, Dr. Suhey Beha, for the opportunity to speak in this event. And thank you to my colleagues as well for engaging in this great discussion. Like Dr. Bailey is mentioning, I agree in the sense that sometimes we see that voting is seen as the endpoint. And my comments really go at thinking of what civic duty is and how we tend to think of civic action as how the way that social movements have been portrayed in American society since the civil rights periods. And many American studies scholars will point to us the way in which movement or action participation in grassroots in particularly has been co-opted by power structures and power systems for us to think about it in very minimal or very reduced ways of action. And particularly as a social movement scholar, one of the ways that I think is helpful to think about is thinking about through this dichotomy of indirect activism versus direct activism. And sometimes we're often left to think with the images of, are you the person that is in the rally, yelling for something like Black Lives Matter, for example? Or are you the person who is talking to politicians as a way to lobby, legislate, and create effective change through the channels and the structures that be? And part of the issue is that when we only tend to think of it through these binaries, is that we run into very limited opportunities for action. And many scholars, just to name a few, people like Dylan Rodriguez and Ruth Gilson Wilmer talk to us about this idea of how movements have been co-opted to things like the nonprofit industrial complex and really pacify movements and move us away from things like grassroots efforts. And really getting us to think about that we must either be in these actions. Real quick, I study immigrant rights and undocumented youth social movements. And one of the things that's beneficiary is that as individuals who don't have the power to vote, right, who don't get to participate in the political system, they offer many grassroots level solutions that offer mobilization impacts, which I'll talk a little bit maybe in some of the discussion that we're having. But I think it's important to think of that imaginary and alternative options and seeing the voting as important in the process of electoral politics, but also to think about different different options into organizing. So I'll leave it there.
Hi there. I want to thank Dr. Vega, my colleagues, Kay, but also Dr. Karen Leong, who organized us and made this event possible. Unfortunately, she's not here, but I know her spirit is here. But thank you for the setup. I think I want to re-emphasize the idea that voting is a tool, as Dr. Bailey helpfully pointed out. Let me begin by noting that, like Aristotle, I believe that elections are contestations among aristocrats. In this era of post-citizen united and multi-billion-dollar campaign, not to mention billionaire candidates running amok, even the most radical feminists among us might have to concede this point to Aristotle, who is definitely not a feminist. Also, like Aristotle, I believe that the many are wiser than the few. And so while the action of the many may not always be just, if my fortunes and futures are dependent on the wisdom of the others, I think I would decidedly elect the wisdom of the many over that of the few, however dangerous or ill-advised that might be. But this is here where Aristotle and I part ways, because of course, unlike him, I am a Democrat, not that kind, a Democrat with a small d. right? Democracy, small d again, as you know, as an idea, is much older than the ancient Athenians, even if we owe an intellectual debt to them for coining the term democratia, or rule by the many, rather than the aristocratic few, which I assume that Aristotle probably favored. The idea that we consent to be ruled, especially by tyrants, is absurd. The idea that we do not consent to be ruled, especially by tyrant, or put differently, that as human, we are more than capable of self-governing, is not necessarily a Western or modern idea either. This notion of self-governance isn't a singular province of a people or a continent. It is an ideal that is as old as human, something Frederick Douglass long understood. So look to history and we will find evidence of people running away from state building and other governing projects, organizing themselves, building communities, and shaping worlds while imparting wisdom about self-rule, predating the oldest of the state-coerced capitalist finance and elitist imagined democracies. And so here we are in the midst of another multi-billion-dollar campaign season with mostly millionaires and even a billionaire running for top offices. But if you think that I think that voting is a waste of time because it's merely an empty sign signifying nothing close to substantive democracy, you would surely be wrong. The reality is, Dr. Bailey is absolutely right. Voting is a tool, and it is among a series of intentional acts that have to be done for democracy to be meaningful and or substantively transformative. I know sometimes people will get it wrong. Sometimes machine gets it wrong, like hanging Chad, right? But without voting, we will have lost one of the few human elements left in this body of politics that is dominated by money, corporations, and malice. Let me be very crystal clear about this. Voting is a basic requirement of any democracy or any democratic political system. And for democracy to be substantive and meaningful, all voting restrictions must be seized, and everyone who is eligible to vote should vote. The 15th Amendment extended the right to vote to African American men, was ratified in 1870, and as early as 1868, 2 years before the ratification, states had already developed various techniques meant to systematically disenfranchise Black people, from vigilante mob violence and state-sponsored massive fraudulent schemes to writing a whole new constitution. That's the Mississippi Constitution, as an example, which also started a whole bunch of other ones. So literally until the Voting Rights Act of 1965, nearly 100 years later, poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and all-white primaries were employed to suppress votes by Black and other people of color. Asian Americans and Native Americans, literally many of whom did not get to vote for the first time until after the Voting Rights Act. So yet in recent years, 25 out of 50 states, that's half, have implemented various voting restrictions that disproportionately affect Black and other people of color voters. So those of us can vote, we must vote. And we have to vote now, right? So that's why I keep saying voting season as opposed to an election season, as opposed to just a day. So if you can vote, you should go out and vote. I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you for all you all's opening thoughts and contributions to the first question. To continue on what Dr. Kwan is bringing up about democracy with a small d, how do you all respond to those who question whether voting is a performance of democracy in a system that is not actually democratic or representative?
So I'll begin the response to that, and really, this is really an excellent example of how the richness of the scholarship in American Studies and particularly at ASU, that we're able to have in very important contexts that both Dr. Martinez and Dr. Kwan laid out for the different dimensions of electoral engagement. I'm an expert in cultural politics, not electoral politics. And cultural politics undergird electoral politics. And the reason why I say that is because this whole notion of democracy with a capital D and a small d, they're inextricably linked in our political system. And what happens is that you have to engage both, and you have to strategically engage both. So part of the performance of voting is that engagement, that basic, as Dr. Kwan said, that basic fundamental thing that you have to do. But here's the problem with how electoral politics as a part of engaging in democracy, capital D, is that what power, this is about politics, and politics is about power. And what power, particularly our current situation, relies on is for you to think that one, voting, the performance of voting is the end all be all, and two, that it stops there and it cuts off the ability to continue to push and advocate and resist. So what we have, as Dr. Kwan pointed out, we basically have an oligarchy. Our society is oligarchical. It is controlled by a small group of people with money, and the vast majority of us don't have no damn money, and the vast majority of us are kept out because the system is designed to maintain that deep social inequality. But even the Democrats, capital D Democrats, are quintessential neoliberals. So what happens is we have two parties that, and I reject the whole false equivalency that some people make, nobody on this panel, but some people make between the Democrats and who I call the Republic KKK. The reason why I reject this false equivalency and why voting is important to democracy, small d, capital D, is that the Republic KKK is ideological monolithic. The Democratic Party, led by neoliberals, but it's ideologically diverse. The reason why it's ideologically diverse, because people, young people, poor people, working class people, LGBTQ plus people, racially diverse people, Native and Indigenous people are engaged. That is the only space of engagement that we have in this duopoly system. And what is happening within the Democratic Party, capital D, is there's a struggle over knowledge, there's a struggle over ideology that's happening within the party, that outside the media, the corporate media represents as disarray, but we know that that is healthy struggle within the Democratic Party, because the Democratic Party cannot be ideological monolithic. If it's ideologically monolithic, we're done. We are done. So you have progressive Democrats, you have the squad, you have squad members primarying or leading the primarying of establishment and neoliberal, like Nancy Pelosi, no shade, she is neoliberal down, but others who've been picked off. They've been picked off they've been primaried, and you have young people of color coming in who are not rich, poor in many cases, definitely working class, who are pushing the party. And the reason why they're able to do that is because their constituencies vote. They vote in primaries, and they vote in the national elections. I forgot what they call it, the general election. That is important. And so part of that voting is a strategy among activism, engaging with your politicians, talking to them, pushing them to adopt policy that that you are interested in and that are in your interests. And that's what has to happen. So the performance is only one part of it, but that performance is important.
Yeah, and my comments go along with what Dr. Bailey is also talking about. I think that in answering these questions, one of the main points I want to center in my response is that folks, at the ultimate thing is we're seeing the right to critique and question the democratic process and representation in this country. And those voices are being heard. And not to do a comparison, but many social movement scholars will say, you know, looking at youth in particular, I look at youth action, and we could see this in comparison to maybe like the civil rights periods where youth are performing those voices and raising those voices to think about themselves. But one of the things that's important in the impact of things like globalization and neoliberalism, as Dr. Bailey points out, is that today's youth are also starting to see themselves in a way where it's not just through a national scope, but also thinking of themselves in this global sphere and thinking of themselves as much more connected to third world struggles and to seeing themselves as international struggles. And as such, confronting things like imperialism, colonialism, racism, and patriarchy that, you know, American Studies as a starting framework seeks to critique and seeks to understand the nation state formation of the United States under those conditions, right? And so it's important to think about some of those things. And I look, and looking through my readings and looking through my work that I did in American Studies, I was reminded of a 1998 presidential address by ASA president at the time, Janice Radaway, which is highlighting this idea of the transnational turn and asking American scholars to really think about how we're centering our work on the United States and thinking about examples from other places around the world. And I think right now is the moment where our youth are looking at places around the world and seeking answers for a different democratic process or representation. Just to the last point I'll make in terms of thinking about some of the comments that Dr. Bailey mentioned on neoliberalism, one of the things that stood out to me in the vice presidential debate, and not that we could take too much things from some of those debates because they are seen as a deflection, as a reaction to critiquing these power systems. But one of the things that stood out to me in the BP debate was particularly how we are seeing this celebration similar to perhaps the celebration of President Barack Obama of the nominee with Kamala Harris as the BP nominee. And on one level, there's celebration of that going on. But at the end, when, you know, there was a question in the debate when they asked them, or they kept repeating if they will end fracking, right? And the idea of, they kept pushing this idea of the new Green Deal, and BP nominee Kamala Harris kept repeating, "We will not end fracking. We will not end fracking," as to assure, you know, the American people, don't worry, we believe in science, right? We believe in the Green Deal, but at the end of the day, we're still capitalists. We're going to keep the machinery running and things of that. So part of the issue is thinking of how we need to start critiquing and not use these moments as deflection, and thinking about the issue with the two-party system and drawing on examples. You know, just to name one, we saw what happened recently in Bolivia, and, you know, the switch of power there, and that's happening in many places. So I think it's time that we need to start looking elsewhere for these examples of places where they've dealt with these colonial, but also neoliberal cycles in their own home countries. Thank you.
I'm going to repeat probably one of the oldest cliche: elections have consequences. They have consequences. If you ever wonder if there are consequences, look at what happened in the last 3 years. for nearly 4 years. Things have been really awful for a lot of people, but particularly people who don't have documentation, people who are not citizens, people who are women, people who are people of color, people who are queer, LGBTQ, trans and queer people, people who are young, people who are old, you name it, right? You can call whatever this administration is, crypto-fascist, authoritarian, tyrannical, term I use usually, right? KKK, white supremacists. They certainly display all of the trope. Oh yeah, I would say that this is distinctly a very different administration than the one we had less than 4 years ago. And so it's important to understand that we have to vote, however minimal it is. I think Professor Martinez and Professor Bailey's work tell us that we can't just focus on the electoral process, that we need to be looking to movements for ideas for transformation, for ideas for policy implementation, but we absolutely have to vote to get some of those ideas in, right? I just want to say very quickly that I shared this on the radio last week, and I shared it 4 years ago, and I'm going to share it again. In 2002, when the French electorate was faced with a choice between a neoliberal, Jacques Chirac, and a crypto-fascist, or not so crypto, Jean-Marie Le Pen of the National Front, the Socialist Party handed out clothespin to people who were walking into the voting booth. They say, here are some clothespin, pinch your nose and vote for Chirac because you cannot vote for a fascist. So I just share that story. I can't tell you how to vote, but just remember, elections have consequences.
Kay, do you mind if I just got, Dr. Kwan, thank you for saying that, because look, this is a choice between fascists and neoliberals, but a party that is ideologically diverse. The Republican KKK, they are not ideologically diverse. They are straight up white supremacists, and they let you know. And this president this president has been enabled, but he is a product of what this country is founded on, and that is white supremacy. Deep and white male, cis hetero, rich white supremacy. So we have to be very clear. And another point that I just want to make, and thanks for both Dr. Martinez and Dr. Kwan for pointing this out. I wanted to just put a little pinpoint a little bit, something extra on the point about the elections have consequences. Because the COVID-19 pandemic, I am very deeply involved in this. And this is a unadulterated disaster. Disaster. Let's be very clear. This administration is profoundly incompetent and callous. They don't give a F-U-C-K. Because the majority of the folks who are dying are Black and brown, Native and indigenous and poor people. And they don't care. They don't care. If this administration is reelected, we are all at risk of dying. We have the worst response to the pandemic of any country in the world. Brazil is only second to us. We have the worst. 8 million people have tested positive officially for COVID. Over 221,000 people dead that we know of. And there's still no testing policy there. Science deniers, the actual person in charge of this response is a science denier. So as Dr. Kwan said, elections have consequences. Most of the folks who died did not have to die. We did not have to be suffering with this pandemic in this way. And so it's really, really important that we are clear about that.
Thank you for all of that. I think that before we bring in some questions from our attendees. The last question, at least for now, to you all, since you all's work speak to cultural politics, speak to social movements, speak to knowledge production, especially among marginalized communities and spaces, can you all speak more to alternatives to the current voting system? And by alternatives, more specifically, getting at what was brought up earlier about how cultural politics and social movements are informing electoral politics and processes.
Well, let me start by saying that recently on a radio program, I had called for greater participation of international election monitoring and observation of the American elections. For nearly 50 years, the United States insisted on elections around the world be subjected to international, particularly the United States monitoring and observations. Since 2002, and in the aftermath of Bush v. Gore, there have been few delegates sent by both Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, and the Organization of American States, the OSA, and other agencies. In 2016, for instance, when candidate Trump alleged that this is a rigged election, obviously largely based on disinformation, the State Department under the Obama administration invited the OAS and others to come and observe the election. The numbers are going to be a lot fewer than that this time around. The British newspaper, The Guardian, recently reported that there will be far fewer observers than planned. And it doesn't seem that the Trump administration is interested in inviting the Organization of American States. So just the OSCE, of course, because we are a member and therefore we're obligated to have observer. And, you know, a lot of people, and just so you know, there's only going to be about 44 people out of the intended 500 people that they were supposed to come. And they're only going to operate on 28 states instead of 50. And you know, some people seems to be shocked that we need election observers. And they say, well, you know, we're not a banana republic and aren't we the oldest democracy in the world? And I said, go talk to 1 in 5 African-American adults in Florida, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia. Those 4 states alone have been disenfranchised, right? So as of 2016, in those 4 states, more than 20% of Black adults are effectively disenfranchised. This is, and they're using many of the tactics that are very familiar to us, those of us who study post-Reconstruction, those of us who study Jim Crow economics and Jim Crow violence. We know these strategies, okay? And so the reason why we have to think about movements in electoral politics as a spectrum of activity in tandem is precisely because without movements for Black lives, without the various civil rights organizations from the Latinx community, from the Asian American community, from the Black community, from the Native American community, without those organizations, without the movements on the ground like BLMs and others, there is no attention that is drawing attention that is paid to the fact that people are being disenfranchised. That's the real fraudulent stuff that's going on, right? So meanwhile, you have daily on the part of the president who discredit the act of voting, so that in hope of discouraging people like you and me to come out and vote, right? So it's a very insidious campaign, but it's also a very tactical campaign. And I do hope that there will be more international observer, because why shouldn't the United States be subject to the same standard as Haiti or Bolivia or South Africa or India, right? At least in South Africa, they took nearly 3 years between 93 and 96 and solicited direct input from more than 10 million people before they finalized their constitution. Or in Nicaragua, where the Sandinista in the late 80s, they travel around in the countryside and had what is the equivalent of town hall meetings, so that people could listen in and debate constitutional principles. We don't have those things. So we need our people movement. We need our social movement to democratize the political parties, because without them, You know, our ballot, if you compare their ballots, the ballots in Nicaragua and Bolivia, which they just had the election this week, the ballot in South Africa, I mean, you know, they look very, very different. And you can then learn a lot about culture and practice of democracy from outside Europe and North America.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and add to this question as well. And I combine the question before, which is what is at stake, right? And combining it into possible solutions or ways of thinking about this. Very early on in this presidential administration, there was a direct attack on cities and locations that deemed themselves as sanctuary cities, right? And for many activists and organizers, this was like a wake-up call. This was something that spoke to them and said, hey, he's speaking about me right now. And there was other folks who also said that there would be real material consequences, not only in political and policy, but also in tangible resources. And we saw that happening across the board as we started seeing, you know, different attacks on people of color and racist rhetoric as well. But in particularly looking again at the immigrant rights movement, what's at stake? Well, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, better known as DACA, implemented originally in 2012, gave protection to qualifying undocumented youth. And since the new the current administration took office, it was rescinded in 2017. Here at ASU, but nationwide, since it was rescinded and upheld by the courts, this is the first cohort of students that are entering college without access to DACA, for example. So now we're talking about students who don't have access to the same financial support or the protection of status in that particular way. Then we saw an attack on TPS or temporary protection status that had been in place since 1980s. And this attacked both Central American migrants and refugees, but also African refugees in particular. And we saw how things like Black Lives Matter and things of that sort found the interconnections between these different protections. And then finally, also we saw the SNAP program being reduced or charged and criminalized of immigrant families and immigrant women of color without access to public needs and being deemed as a public charge. And the last one, as we go into the voting booth, that I'd like to remind folks is that while we're thinking about something like voting and the privilege of voting, there's still, you know, kids and families who are separated from one another in detention camps as we speak right now. And that was something that was churned, the Florida Settlement Agreement that had been in place since 1997, right? The idea that one, family should be together if they're in detention, which is already a cruel punishment, but then the idea that children were able to be with a legal guardian should they be, so that they wouldn't be in detention. So all of that, what I'm saying is that we have seen people fight these criminalization process. And when there is an attack on immigrants, we could naturally see that as an extension to attack in the way that citizenship is constructed in this country across race, gender, and sexuality. And as such, when we saw the attack on sanctuary cities, even before the current administration took office, we saw how activists saw that as not only an attack to immigrant communities, but spreading as an attack to these different marginalized groups.
I just real quick, because I know we running out of time. My colleagues have laid it out really eloquently. We got to get money out of politics. We have to legislatively overturn the court decision that ruled that corporations are people. No way. We have to make it easier to vote. And so therefore we have to push the Democrat. We got to push the Democrats on the money out of politics. We also have to push the Democrats, if they regain control, put in the universe if they will, that they have to deal with voting rights. They have to create legislation. The courts rule but the legislature can legislate what they want to legislate. They are not constrained by the court in that way. They need to legislate voting rights, get money out of politics, make it easier to vote, get rid of all this voter suppression shit that's going on. And then third is that by virtue of making it easier to vote, they have to expand the window for voting. We have to, so like Dr. Kwan said, there has to be more of a voting season. We can't have this, the pinnacle day is November 3rd. That's cray-cray, right? We have to expand the voting season. People need to be able to mail in their ballots. People need to everybody needs to be able to do what Colorado does, what Arizona does, mail in ballots. You should not have to be standing in line for 2 hours. I voted on the first day of early voting in Indiana. I stood in line for 2.5 hours. That's cray-cray. So, but that's what I would suggest.
Thank you all for, this has been a very robust discussion so far. And I'm looking forward to see what our attendees, some questions that they have for you all as well. If any attendees have any questions, please submit them to the Q&A box and we can read it off.
Hi, everyone. I'm Claudia Sadowski-Smith, professor of English here at ASU, and I want to moderate the Q&A. If you guys have any questions, please post them. I hope you can. We haven't received any questions yet. So in the meantime, I'll be happy to ask some follow-up questions to our panelists, maybe just one, see how it goes. Yes, and I do want to thank everybody who's been involved in this event, and Karen Leong and Kay Anderson and myself were on the organizing committee for this event, and unfortunately Karen couldn't come today. So we haven't gotten any questions, so I'm just going to ask a follow-up question to Dr. Bailey, but I think all the other panelists can probably jump in. Since you made the point about the Democratic Party with the D as being a party of neoliberalists right now, or being one of the wings of the party, or definitely being dominated by that particular philosophy, and economic philosophy, social philosophy, cultural philosophy. How could you, okay, we're getting questions. So very quickly, how would you actually quickly define that, and how does Kamala Harris fit into that? Dr. Martinez did mention Kamala as well, because you're talking about diversity within the party, but how does she fit in there?
So first I'll answer the first part of the question. Is that what I mean when I'm talking about the Democratic Party is being led by neoliberals? They are hardcore capitalists. They believe in money, and they believe in supporting even though they talk a different game, but they believe in an upward distribution of wealth and not a downward one. Meaning that they don't talk about the poor. We have an intense, and I hope I said that the previous thing correctly, but we have profound poverty. The neoliberals always talk about the middle class. They never talk about the poor. They always talk about the sort of, they critique the Republican KKK for their economic logics, but their economic logics are similar. It's just that they focus more on the middle class, but neither focuses on the poor, and half of our population lives in poverty. About 140 million people live in poverty. So, and you see the fracture within the party, which is a good fracture, because those who are part of the progressive Democrats, the Squad and others, the Latinx caucus, the Congressional Black Caucus, they kind of neoliberally. But you have a movement in the Democratic Party that's focusing on poverty, that's focusing on universal health care, single payer. So notice that Speaker Pelosi has resisted that. Why? She gets lots of money from the healthcare system, neoliberal. All right. So, but she's being pushed by Ann Biden as well. They're going to be pushed. We weren't having this conversation even about a public option before. Now that conversation is back on the table. And so those are some of the things. Kamala Harris. So here's the thing, right? So this is what makes it really interesting for me. I think we got too caught up in the euphoria, in the rapture with President Obama. Obama was a neoliberal down. Of course, the only way he would be president is that he has to be a neoliberal, because when you Black, you can't be all that. You can't be cray-cray like the Rona monster in chief in the current White House. So of course, Obama was neoliberal. He's a capitalist. He's an imperialist. I mean, he's sitting in he occupied that seat of imperialism pretty well. But because he's Black, he's cool, from kind of from the south side of Chicago, activist, all of that. We lost focus on the fact that we did not push him to be more progressive. He is not progressive. Not progressive. And Kamala, we have to be careful not to make the same mistake. I don't think that Kamala Harris is like Obama in that way, but I also think that Kamala Harris needs to be pushed to be as progressive as possible, right? Because otherwise we will fall into the same trick bag where we get caught up in symbolism. I love my Black folk in seats of power, but I'm gonna need for you to do stuff on behalf of poor people, working class people, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, Native and Indigenous people, elderly, young people, immigrants, practice, believe in religious diversity and not do this Christian foolishness that we're doing. So I'm gonna need for you to push for those kinds of policies and stand up for those folk, as opposed to just representing Blackness in the White House and being a neoliberal and pushing for policies that run counter to our self-interest, our collective interests. Hope I answered the question.
I would just add that remember that President Obama never mentioned the word poverty or the poor until the second inauguration, right? Until his State of the Union address to after the second inauguration. So that's a good clue. I agree with Dr. Bailey that I think that Harris and Biden are actually to the left of Obama. Certainly their platform and the policy that they're conceding to, and I say that very intentionally, they're conceding to are to the left of the moderate, practically conservative policy that Obama ran on. Remember, President Obama, when a state senator in Illinois introduced, not just he introduced introduced the welfare reform bill in Illinois, not co-signer, but actually introduced it. So that's the kind of politics, that's the neoliberal politics that Dr. Bailey is referencing. So it's important to understand that. One of the questions is, how do we see vote as an act of hope? Watch Selma. I've been telling people this. Go watch Selma. Selma is a wonderful film because it is a fact that we are the legacies. We are the inheritors of people who have struggled for hundreds of years, so that we get the right. Those of us who have that privilege to vote. Watch Selma. People fought and died for that right to vote, and so long as we are voting, we know that we're pushing back against some of the most vicious, malicious, violent of white supremacist polity. And that's what we're doing when we vote. So because white supremacist polity is the one that is fairly exclusionary and very, very few people are allowed to vote. Universal suffrage does not in those people's mind. Listen, these people organize and intentionally talk about the different way, creative way to get people not to vote, right? And then there's a question about, is there validity to progressive starting their own party? I think progressive need to do whatever they need to do. Sometimes it's within a party structure, sometimes it's in a grassroots structure, sometimes it's in a nonprofit structure, however limiting that might be. But it's really inspiring to look at some of the some of the countries outside of the US that have multi-party system, where ideas, there's a many more different set of ideas. So here, only in Arizona does people think someone like John McCain, who is now had been beatified, is considered a moderate, right? I mean, this is a warmonger, okay? This is someone who is really into the US empire as a project, and he is seen as a moderate. That's how far to the right we are. That's what happened when you don't have multi-party system.
I'll go ahead and add to some of the great comments my colleagues have shared as well. And, the perfect example of President Barack Obama as a neoliberal force as well, in the context of my research, is thinking of deferred action for childhood arrivals, right? That program gave the opportunity for qualified, educated, good, no criminal record individual to basically have protection and a job, essentially. And that said to 80,000 qualified undocumented youth, you have the right to basically be in this country, right? While it told the rest of the 11 million immigrant population, you don't have the right, right? And that selective process is a big part of what we're talking about with this notion neoliberalism, that gets to select things as simple as, who chooses to live and who chooses to be excluded from the process of living, or at least living in, better conditions, to put it that way. And part of the question about hope is that I go back to how things were essentially previous to these 4 years. And while what is in the ballot, as Dr. Bailey said, is this idea of neoliberalism versus fascism, part of that is the hope is that we could essentially go back to at least a neoliberal moment for the time being, and that we are able to do grassroots efforts to push our political systems, and also to think beyond a two-party system, thinking of how we could revolutionize that. And so the hope for me, at least, lands again also in youth, and youth have the vision to imagine those conditions, because as we grow older, I think we do become much more tarnished and kind of become part of the system, to put it that way. But I think youth is where I see the hope and the possibilities of what some of those things could essentially be. But through our intellectual discussions, we're able to contribute to different alternatives as well.
Hi, this is Dr. Vega. I am just going to field one of the questions because I accidentally moved it into a separate column. So I wanted to make sure we got it answered. Regardless of your presidential preference, do you think that those who are voting for Biden are settling just rid of Trump? And what are some aspects of the presidential party's campaign do you think people overlook because of their personal feelings of the other presidential choice?
So I think that one thing, and I wanted to say this toward the beginning of the discussion, is that when you're voting, you're not voting for individuals. You're voting for a regime. And so we can't get caught up in Biden-Harris and comparing Biden-Harris to the Rona monster in chief and his, vice president, that person. You can't get caught up in that, because what has happened is that we have an entire fascist, cruel, incompetent, stupid, science-denying regime of greedy, corrupt, crazy MFs. I mean, bottom line. Now, you've got some of that in the Democratic Party, but it's no comparison. No comparison. And so I think when we're voting, you have to, one, remember that you're voting a regime, that the executive, it's just the executive. The legislature has a lot of power. The legislature has a lot of power. We have ceded the legislatures to, or legislation to the Republican KKK. And when you concede to white supremacy, homophobia, misogyny, heteropatriarchy, all of that, then we are where we are. Secondly, you have to also understand the local political scene, right? So you've got to vote for state and local legislatures. You've got to vote for governors, right? Because these local legislatures and executives, they have things to do with judges. There's a whole judge thing that we've just totally ceded to the Republican KKK, which is why we've got a federal judiciary that's Klan, full of Klan people, full of Klansmen and women, right? And that's what we're gonna get. Now, the Rona Monster in Chief has appointed about 30%. I think it's between 30. Dr. Quan, Dr. Martinez, y'all might know the specific percentage, but about 30% of the federal bench. And these folks are crazy. So you have to keep that in mind. You're not just voting for the president and the vice president. You're voting for a regime. You're voting for judges. You're voting for legislatures. You're voting for local executives, the whole nine. And so it becomes very, the Biden-Harris become a part of this huge endeavor that we need to focus on and not put so much emphasis on Biden-Harris.
I think that's right. I think that elections have consequences, and you may not. I don't. Well, first of all, I want to say that elections have consequences, and the consequences are much more than just presidential. But the consequences have to do with policies and the judiciary system. And just remember that in less than half of the time than President Barack Obama, Trump has 24% of the share of all active judges. So that means that he is well ahead. If at the same rate that nearly half of the federal bench will be appointed by him if reelected. So that is a specter that we have to contend with. The second thing I want to say is that we're not settling for Biden and Harris. We are voting against fascism, if you were asking about my choice. And again, I'm not, I think that voting is something that you need to not trust other people on. You need to study the issues. You need to make a decision. But it is something that, especially there's so much misinformation going around. It is really important that you do the research. Yesterday, as a political scientist, I spent more than 2 hours researching on all the judges on my ballot, so that I could do the early voting, and it's worth it. It's worth it if you think about the children that are being interned right now. Many of them have been separated from their family for a very, very long time. If you think about the deaths that Dr. Bailey was evoking, this is and the millions of people who have been sick since March, if not earlier, and who may go bankrupt because they don't have the proper health insurance. It's more than worth it.
Okay, we have about 4 more minutes, and there's one more question that came in, which I also thought is very important, which is basically what kind of progressive policies could you guys imagine? And you've been talking about grassroots policies, maybe that can fit in there. So if we can all say something and keep to like 4 more minutes, that would be great. Thank you so much, everybody.
I'll just say one thing because I think a lot has been covered. Universal health care. Our healthcare system is a colossal mess during a pandemic. There is no reason why people should not have healthcare. And millions upon millions upon millions of people in this country have no healthcare whatsoever. And there are millions and millions upon millions more who have junk healthcare.
I would say the same. Universal health care and the Green New Deal.
Yeah, I would just echo some of those things and just say that essentially, we're seeing in our youth a radicalization in terms of thinking about climate change and global warming as being one of the pressing issues that they are thinking about in their lifetime and what impacts we'll see happening. So in terms of youth remaining engaged, I do think that youth will remain engaged. And I think that they will continue to push for these progressive policies that go beyond just candidates, as some of my colleagues have mentioned as well.
Thank you, everybody. So now I'm going to pass this over to Dr. Vega. She's going to say some concluding things about American Studies in the program. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. Thank you for your great question. Thank you for the panelists for taking the time to do this and engaging us with so much thoughtful discussion and points, I think, that are going to give us all more things to think about, food for thought in the future. Thank you.
So I just want to thank Dr. Bailey, Dr. Kwan, and Dr. Martinez, and a special thank you to, again, Dr. Sadowski-Smith, Dr. Leong, Kay, and our staff, Jeannie, Coquette, for all the work that you've done in placing us in dialogue. Thank you, attendees, for all the wonderful questions you had, and though we weren't able to address them all, I certainly think this is a wonderful start to some great conversations that need to be had. It's been a pleasure to have shared virtual space with all of you, and I truly appreciate the conversations that you're bringing to American Studies and to ASU in general. I think we all understand the complexity and the consequences of the election on our various communities. And again, I'd like to offer one more time, if you want to be a part of this conversation, if you want to know more about American Studies, please send an email to myself, Dr. Suhey Vega, email is on your screen, to get on our email list, to get updates about our events and other ASU American Studies news. And yes, of course, and if you're a grad student, please consider enrolling to the American Studies class that we'll be offering next spring, American Studies 502. Once again, thank you all for attending and actively participating. If you're able and eligible, please vote on November 3rd. If you're not eligible, please help get out the vote and continue being engaged, being enraged, and being active in building new potential futurities. Thank you all.